Hi, I'm Elena. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to another recommendation video. Today I want to recommend 7 historical fiction books that you can fall in love with. Historical fiction is a genre that I truly love and enjoy. It is often the genre I go to for comfort and adventure and for just having a great time. So today I want to recommend you 7 books that you can have that comfortable, great time with. Before we get into the recommendations, I want to let you guys know what I find really important in historical fiction, or what I really enjoy in historical fiction. One of the things I tend to really enjoy is if an historical fiction centers around a group of women, and I prefer often when these are just everyday kind of people. I'm not big on reading about royals or about really rich or famous people. I usually really like to get to know an historical setting in its everyday life. So maybe in a way that my life would have been like in a historical setting, in a historical time period. Of course, I like it when these women did very amazing things, but I often really appreciate it if it's just about the everyday life. Within that, I also really enjoy it if we get a lot of practical stuff about what it was like to live in that period of time. So I really like to know what people are eating. I like to know what people are wearing. I like to know what people's houses look like. I like to know what people would do in an emergency situation, like where would you go for medical help? What would happen if you were giving birth? Where do you get your food? Things like that. I love those kind of details. Historical consistency is also really important to me. I have to believe we're in a certain period of time, so surroundings, clothes, food, language, everything. That is really quite important to me. I think that's probably a general thing within historical fiction readers. You just have to believe that you are in a certain period of time. And lastly, but definitely not least, I really enjoy good romance. And almost all recommendations that I have is a really good romance. I really don't mind when there is not a romance plot within a book, but I tend to enjoy it most if there is at least a subplot of romance. So now that you know what kind of historical fiction books I enjoy, let's get into the recommendations. The first book I want to recommend is a book that I read quite recently. That is Love and Fury by Samantha Silva. This is a historical fiction about Mary Wollstonecraft, who I'm sure you all know was a very famous feminist who wrote an amazing book on the rights of women, a vindication on the rights of women. I always forget the exact details of the title. I also have not read the book, which I really do want to. But this is a historical take on her life, and the way that it's written I loved so incredibly much. I had not heard anyone talk about this book, so when I read it and I loved it so much, I was really surprised. This book has 2 storylines. In the first storyline we follow a midwife, Mary Wollstonecraft's midwife, while she gives birth to the woman that we now know as Mary Shelley, who of course wrote Frankenstein. This was a very difficult and straining birth, which resulted in Mary Wollstonecraft her death. And knowing that it would probably result in her death, she decides to write a letter to her daughter, who she's also going to call Mary. This letter is the other storyline in which she tells her entire life story. I don't know that much about Mary Wollstonecraft, so I cannot for sure tell you that all the events in the fictional letter is true, but oh my, is it eventful. I really enjoyed it because there happens so much. You can really follow Mary Wollstonecraft's intellectual journey throughout her relationship with men, with herself, with family, and you can really see the basis of her feminist beliefs represented in that fictional letter. I also really like the perspective of the midwife because it brings us home, it brings us a moment of silence, and just the way this book was balanced was something that I truly appreciated in this book. The writing is very good, and I think Samantha Silva, because this was published in 2021 I believe, and I think Samantha Silva is getting so much better as an author, and I'm really enjoying that. The other historical fiction I want to recommend is one I think I've recommended before, and it's a bit of a booktube darling, but I'm going to mention it again in case you haven't heard of it before. It is The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. This is a Pride and Prejudice retelling, and retelling in a way that we follow Mary Bennet's perspective. If you have read Pride and Prejudice, I'm sure you know Mary Bennet. Mary Bennet is one of the underappreciated, more silent, nerdy sisters of all the Bennet sisters. The main character of Pride and Prejudice, of course, is the very present and lively Lizzie Bennet, so her more silent sister gets a story of her own. And after reading this book, I'm seriously debating whether or not I like Mary or Lizzie better, because they're both so amazing. This is a chunky book, but it really deserves every single page. We start out with the events during Pride and Prejudice and with the imagined, of course, events after Pride and Prejudice. Those imagined events are really fun because we get a few snippets of what Janet Hadlow thought the life of the two older sisters would be like, but we also get to see what would happen if Mr. Bennet would die. In Pride and Prejudice, it's pretty clear that the sisters are not in a financial stable situation, and of course we get to know in Pride and Prejudice that some sisters get out of that, but Mary is not one of them. So we follow her through her journey of safety. Of course, her ultimate hunger for independence, her difficult relationship with her father, but most of all her journey towards finding meaning, both intellectually and also on a more emotional level. This is a great one. It made me cry 2 or 3 times, definitely the ending. And somewhere around the middle I cried as well. But all happy tears because it was just so beautiful. Another book that I listened to was The Mercies by Kieran Milkwood Hargrave. This is another amazing feminist historical fiction. We are set in quite a unique setting for the books that I usually read. Our setting is a Norwegian coastal village in 1600. In this coastal village, all the men earn their money by fishing. But on a certain night there is a big storm and all the men die at sea. Which means that in this village all the women are left to tend for themselves. Which is of course a struggle, but it goes well for a while until a certain peculiar figure, a Scottish man, is sent to the coastal village to rule out witchcraft, because it's not possible that women can fend for themselves without it being witchcraft, which is of course a great premise and plot in itself. So if that appeals to you, the writing is also amazing. There are some twisty turny romances in this book and also a lot of great characters. I think my favorite character, probably everyone's favorite character, was Maren, who is in the world of Little Women, she is the Jo. She is very self-sufficient, used to the situation that the village is in, and of course she opposes this weird Scot who comes to their village to say how they should live. This book does take some dramatic turns and it does have a few content warnings within that, so maybe look that up before you start reading this. It is an adventurous and very clever novel. I have 4 more books that I want to show you guys, of books that I actually own. So I have The Foundling by Stacey Holz. Stacey Holz is one of my favorite historical fiction authors. I think the thing that I like most in her novels is the fact that she is able to describe something so visually that immediately you can see the historical setting in front of you. And I also think she's just really good at creating historical settings. We are in London in 1754 and we meet a working class woman who lives together with her father and her brother, and she sells fish on the street, and at a certain point we discover that she is pregnant, but she is not married and she is in no position to keep the baby. When she gives birth, she decides to leave her child at the Foundling Hospital, which is an actual place in London. I think it still exists, and these children would be raised to be able to get a decent job. Often they would become servants. If later in life you were able to raise money and give your child a decent life, you could go back to the Foundling Hospital and get your child back for a certain amount of money. I think the amount of money equals the amount of money that your child has cost the Foundling Hospital, which there are some weird policies in this book, but I think it's all based on history. So our main character saves up money and goes back to the Foundling Hospital to pick up her daughter, but she discovers that someone else has already picked up her daughter, claiming that she was her mother. And that is where the novel sets off. We follow 2 storylines, one of the mother, one of the daughter. The daughter storyline is when she is an infant. So the storylines are quite close together, and it's a bit of a slow historical fiction. The adventure is definitely within the plot that I just explained. Isn't much more adventure in this book. It's quite a slow character-based historical fiction, which I personally really enjoy. Another recent favorite is this book, which has quite the title. This is The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Sheffer and Annie Barrows. This book was written by, I think, Mary Ann Sheffer, and Annie Barrows adapted it to become a novel after she passed away. This is a novel in letters set just after the Second World War. We follow Juliet, who is an author who lives in London, who starts writing letters to a man in Guernsey. The letters are mainly about the time in Guernsey during the Second World War. Slowly, Juliet starts to build a relationship with multiple people on Guernsey, and she goes to visit there, and she develops a real strong relationship with everyone on Guernsey. Things start to happen, things become so heartwarming, the stories of the Second World War are so heartbreaking. I am not a big reader of war stories or the Second World War time period in general, but this was such a heartwarming story, looking back at everything that happened to people that may not have been as well known as the stories that we do. This is definitely a book that you should read for the warm, fuzzy relationship and feelings. and lovely stories. Another book I want to recommend by one of my favorite authors, who is Toni Morrison, is A Mercy. This was one of her more recent novels. It's a really short one. This is set in a time when a lot of different settlers would come to the USA, and we follow a Dutchman. He marries, he settles in America, he has a home, and of course, to make the home and everything around the home work, he employs, or what you can say, employ different people. And all these different people are in a way a representation of all the different layers of society and people that have grown up and have to live in America together in this time, which was so interesting. We get the stories of different kind of people, very much within the awareness that everyone has always been there. And that is something that I really admire in Toni Morrison's writing. There are different storylines in here, and all of those storylines really exist within their own right. This novel doesn't necessarily invite you to judge or to prefer one character over another, but to give you a certain awareness of that everyone exists and have feelings and emotions and a sense of want and need. And I really appreciated that in such a short novel. This may be a bit of a harder read at parts, but I really enjoy the kind of books that are set on one place with all different kind of people. This is definitely the book for that. The last book I want to recommend is a book I read quite a while ago, and that is enfj 10 minutes 38 seconds in this strange world. This is part historical fiction, part contemporary. We follow Leila, who is a sex worker in Istanbul, and she is found dead in a dumpster in the beginning of the novel. Before she dies, she recollects everything about her life, everything about her growing up in Turkey, and about all the people that she has met in her childhood, but also in her life as a sex worker. We get to know a lot of different, very interesting people in this book. One of the things that I enjoyed most was the setting in Turkey and Istanbul, which is not a setting that I have read from before a lot. Even though certain decades felt very familiar to me, they didn't feel familiar to me in a Turkish setting. Characters have great representation, but are also quite heartbreaking to read about at times. This is definitely a tough novel, I think, but it's definitely worth a read. enfj's writing is very accessible and easy to get into. I think from all the historical fictions I have discussed today, I would say that this and the writing also of Stacey Holmes is the most accessible. Also because, of course, this is partly contemporary as well. So those are the 7 historical fictions for you to fall in love with. Let me know if you've read any of these, or if I have piqued your interest to read any of these 7 novels. If you have a recommendation for me for another historical fiction that I can madly fall in love with, then please let me know in the comments down below. For now, I hope you have a lovely day or evening, and I hope to see you in another video. Doei!